president turned to them and he said, I need an answer, like do a meta study. Is this real? They reported back on July 29th, 1979, the results of this study will be reassuring to scientists, but disturbing to policymakers. If the carbon dioxide release continues, this panel finds no reason to believe that climate changes will not result, and no reason to believe those changes will be negligible.
Okay, welcome to the show. Today's guest is David Lipsky. He is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Absolutely American, and Although, of course, you end up becoming yourself, which was the basis for the acclaimed movie The End of the Tour. He has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, Harper's, Rolling Stone, This American Life, All Things Considered, and New York, and is the recipient of the National Magazine Award and the GLAAD Media Award. His work has been collected in the Best American Short Stories and the Best American Magazine Writing, and he teaches at New York University. Welcome to the show, David. How's it going?
Great to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for being on this. I really look forward to this this interview, actually. It's was high up on my list of the ones I wanted to do.
Thank you. I'm glad I've already earned an actually.
We have here your book, The Parrot and the Igloo. This is your book that just came out. Why don't you go ahead and start by telling us a bit about your new book?
It's just the story of, it tells three stories. The basic thing is people who made our world, because if you compared 1870 to 1770, people cursed more. They could talk about things more forthrightly in theater or in novels, but otherwise the tech hadn't changed that much. And 1770 wouldn't have been that qualitatively different from 1670. But once we became technologized, things really, really changed. It built a new world for us. And that's the first story the book tells. Then the second story that the book tells, first story is people who made our world. Then the second story is people who noticed that there might be kind of a problem, that essentially the different things that were generating smoke, that the smoke might be blowing back in ways that we couldn't anticipate. And then the last story it tells is the people who, for money, lied about that problem. And it's a story that each part of it begins in a different time. But the idea that I had, first, it's a great story, but second, it tells us how and why we're living now, and then what kinds of things we might expect in the future. But the reason that I told the story is just, I always like to know, being born is just do you know those, do you ever see The Flight Attendant, that HBO show?
I did not.
Okay, it's great. It's if you like thrillers about flight attendants, it's the best one. But it uses a classic thriller opening, which is main character wakes up in a bed, doesn't know how they got there. And there's a knock on the door from the housemaid. It's a hotel room. And then you turn over and there's a dead body next to you. And you have to figure out what's been happening for the last couple of days or hours. And then you also have to decide what to do next. And kind of being born is like that. You just join this story that has been in progress for a while. And you kind of have to figure out, okay, what was happening before? How did we come to be in this spot? And then what kinds of things should we be looking towards now? And that's what this book is about for the climate.
Okay. And one of the things I found interesting about the beginning was
it's the flight attendant for climate change. But anyway, go on.
One of the things I found interesting about the beginning was talking about Edison and kind of the idea that both something that's so good for humanity was created, but then it can lead to things that, for one, obviously he wasn't thinking about back then, or anybody else that was involved in that, Tesla or otherwise, and how something that's so good can result in something becoming a problem that later on people have to face. I think that there's some parallels to be drawn between Einstein, when Einstein sent the letter to, what was it, Roosevelt, that he sent a letter to say, hey, the Germans are building this bomb. and you need to be on this because it's better for you to have this bomb than it is for the Germans to have this bomb. And I think about what we're dealing with the climate change as potentially us being on the same step, right? That these people that invented something so amazing that has done so much for us, that could potentially end up being something that in future generations could cause massive amounts of death, and possibly the end of our civilization as we know it. Did you find, while you were researching for this book, those types of things to draw parallels to this kind of stuff?
Of course, but one of the interesting things, that's something that when we look at the past is easy to forget, is that people in the past don't know they're in the past. So if you're reading about Edison in the 1870s, he thinks, man, I am the cutting edge. This is as far as time has gotten. And so Tesla is someone who understood exactly some of the challenges that we would face. He said, what will man do when the oil fields are depleted, when the coal is gone? Only one thing, he will move to the tides and the waterfalls. So they understood,
Wow.
of course, they understood the kind of scarcity that we'd be facing. One of the things that Tesla thought when he introduced the idea of water power is that he would be dealing with that problem. Then a guy named Svante Arrhenius, who was the first scientist who really figured out how carbon dioxide would affect climate, he instantly started seeing that our fuel reserves were going to run out. So a lot of the problems that we're facing were anticipated. That's one of the wild things. It's a little bit like if you were watching Lord of the Rings, or if we were living Lord of the Rings in real time, and the elves who made the rings, they were like, hey, geez, Glendriel, like I think this ring could cause some serious trouble later on. You think maybe we should just throw it into Mount Doom now? And that is one of the things that they were thinking about. Like, a lot of this was anticipatable, and that's part of what was great about writing the book.
Wow, that's really really crazy to think that obviously Tesla was a very prescient person
Yeah.
and was capable of looking at things so far ahead of time, and it kind of almost draws comparisons to what we have now going on nowadays, where we have certain people that literally just live in the moment, and that's the only thing that's important to them, and then you have people that are much more future forward and thinking about what could possibly happen with these things down the line. Do you think that's the most surprising thing that you learned during that, or was there something more surprising than that during the, what was it, 7 years of research you did
7
for the
years,
book, or
yeah.
7 years of writing?
No, but it was a thrilling thing. The most surprising thing I learned was in 1979, President Carter, who was our environmental movement kind of started in the early 70s, and Nixon was the first. Nixon, not a good person. I hope I don't offend the few Nixon lovers who are still extant and
Holding on.
for something great to watch on YouTube. But weirdly enough, he did it just to keep us off his back. But he signed more environmental law and more strong environmental laws than anybody in history. Carter was in office about 6 years after Nixon was kicked out of office, basically. And some scientists whose word couldn't be refuted, said, "This is going to happen, and it's going to start happening soon." And he took no action. None of us took action. That was the most surprising thing. And I read it. I read that 7 years ago, and I was so shocked by it. I couldn't understand how that happened. And that is why I wrote the book. So that was the most surprising thing, was the discovery that between 77 and 79, everything that we've responded to as news about this interesting situation in which we find ourselves, that was known both broadly and then at the highest levels of government.
And I did a podcast with Lowell Bear, who wrote Earth's Emergency Room, and he has been working on the Endangered Species Act for almost 60 years, and he also was there during the Nixon administration. And he pointed out during those days, though politics have always been partisan, they were less partisan. There's so much more reaching across the aisle. There is so much more of what you were just saying, people just going, okay, to get you off my back, I'm willing to go this route. And it was really interesting in talking to him, as obviously the climate and the animals that inhabit our world go hand in hand. He talked a lot about the pollinators, the bees and the birds and all that business, and the balance of the ecology. But how, whether you were on the right or left, animals were a very interesting thing. Like, people wanted to know that their kids would grow up and still experience tigers and red-tailed hawks and all of these other things, and it didn't matter what side of the spectrum you ended up on. So that's pretty interesting to hear, because I think where we're getting nowadays with everything being so polarized and so partisan, and pushing each other to these places where it's like we can't possibly agree with something the other side agrees with, to even hear that Nixon was willing to push that through is really surprising in today's political environment, to tell you the truth. That is.
Yeah, now it
that's very
seems like the
surprising.
Republicans have decided that all the animals vote blue, so they don't have to worry about
Yes.
making their lives better. We've lost their vote. We just can't get them to the polls. Like, we want to stop them from the polls.
We have lost the educated liberal vote and also the squirrels. That seems about right nowadays. Sounds about right. So as far as that goes, with writing the book, you said that made you want to write the book.
Yeah.
What did you want from writing the book?
I think it's the things that everybody, the basic things you want. There's a great writer named Elizabeth Hardwick. She was married to a poet named Robert Lowell, who just gave her a hell of a time. He was one of the first really well-known bipolar artistic figures. And when he was in one of the manic phases of his syndrome, he would go off and marry somebody else and live with them and have children, and then he would come back. It's a great poet. I think a difficult person to be married to, but Elizabeth Hardwick is a brilliant writer, and then just a great suffering hero, but a brilliant writer. And she said a great thing: there are only two good reasons to write anything: revenge and money. And so this, I think, was a good combination, which was just revenge on the people who didn't tell the story properly. And then just there's the basic thing. One of the interesting things that I've noticed about climate is it's not a very powerful train, but it's a big, broad train. And there are always people hanging on to it, hoping it will take them somewhere professionally interesting. And I guess to some degree, I'm one of those people. So I had a book that was, on paper, my choices look sterling, but once you're writing anything, you're sitting there hoping a lot of people will buy it and talk about how cool you are. But I had a very large contract, part of the research of which had to do with, God, any writer who would say the research of which, you end the podcast right there. It's just like, that person can't talk. But part of the research for it had to involved seeing how the electrical grid worked. And I was just reading the history of the grid, and I came across that moment when President Carter received word from the National Academy of Sciences. And I thought, I can't believe that happened. So that was the basic reason, was to tell people this fascinating thing that I learned about our history, about how far back in time the climate story goes. And then this fascinating thing that I learned about us as a people. I don't just mean Americans. I mean all of us on this planet, this fascinating thing that I learned about us as a people. But one way of talking about it, and you and I were talking about this a little bit in the digital version of the Green Room, is, from the book, but before you read the book, did you have any idea, when you thought about it, how far back did you think climate research went? Or the idea yeah.
I thought most of everything, as far as what we have made important to us today, has came from 60s and 70s, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And mostly people think it was the 90s, because that's when former Vice President Gore started talking about it. 70s is great. That means you know when it started coming into public consciousness. But we started learning about how climate worked in the 1820s. And one other thing that's fascinating is this became an issue that people would care about, like at your store, right? The kinds of people
Mhm.
who care a lot about their purchases and about what they eat and about how they deal with their compost. It would seem like it comes from people who are not the mainstream, right? The mainstream is this, and these are people who are different than the mainstream, but they're not in the center of thinking. But
Mhm.
in the case of the research, like Fourier, who was the first person to really begin thinking about why our planet is warm at all, he started doing this work in the 1820s. And then in 1859, the British scientist who asked himself this key question, which is, it's very clear that something in our atmosphere keeps heat on the planet. So what
Mm.
Fourier asked himself in the 1820s was, okay, the sun is obviously coming down, it's hitting the ground, and what is stopping that energy from just going right back out into space? And what he came up with when he did research into this is that there was something in the atmosphere that was keeping that heat here. That's kind of where the word greenhouse comes from. In fact, Fourier is French, and he used more of a food metaphor. It was like the glass lid on a pot, which is keeping the heat in the system. Then about 40 years later, that's 1824. About 40 years later, 35 years later, the lead British scientist of his time, a man named John Tyndall, he's like, okay,
Mhm.
Fourier said there's something in the air that's keeping it. Let me find out what that thing is. And it took him about 6 painstaking months, but he tested, it must have been a fun thing. He tested every element of the atmosphere he could think of. He would heat things and he would see if it trapped the heat. He was so interested. He had a guy from Bond Street. That was where all the perfumers were in 1859 in London. And he had a gentleman from Bond Street come and give him all the perfumes, like cinnamon oil, like sandalwood oil, to see if there was something in there that was trapping the heat. And he couldn't find it. And he was going to give up the experiment. And then he tested coal gas.
Oh.
Coal gas is generated by gaslight. Now, to us, gaslight is I'm in a bad relationship. That's what gaslight means. But
Yeah.
gaslight then, that was just a huge step forward. You couldn't, people didn't take walks at night. There were no night classes. There were no clubs until about the 1850s, because if you walked around at night, you couldn't see the person who was hitting you on the back of the head and going through your wallet.
Oh.
So a giant change. You didn't really have nightlife before gaslight. So that's a giant technology from the middle of the 19th century. And so he tested that, and it turned out that the coal gas that was generated by people heating the streets, people lighting the streets, that the light would go through it, but then when sunlight warmed the earth and it was turned into infrared waves, that the waves were stopped by the basic pattern of carbon dioxide's molecules. Do you know when you're like parking and you go over that kind of claw thing? So you go and it chunks under you, but if you try to back up, it rips your tires.
Mhm.
That's how
Yeah.
carbon dioxide works with the sun's energy. It can pass through once it heats the planet, and it is converted into,
Can't go back.
it can't go back out. So he learned that water vapor and carbon dioxide, that's what keeps the heat in our system. And then about 40 years after that, 35 years after that, the leading scientist in Sweden, a man named Svante Arrhenius, um,
Mhm.
he sat down. He had just gotten married, and he sat down on Christmas Eve, 1894. Now, Arrhenius would be the first Swede to receive the Nobel Prize, and he would then lead the Nobel Labs. So both he and Tyndall are the leading scientists of their nations. By the time Arrhenius, about 10 years before he died, the Times said that he was a chemist, but the Times said he was the most famous chemist alive. Like he
Mm.
was so that is how big a figure discovered how carbon dioxide worked. Anyway, so he sat down Christmas Eve, 1894. And when he stood back up again, it was a year later. He said they were the most
Wow.
tedious calculations of his life. He said he had never worked as hard on anything. The only thing that was close to it was cramming for exams when he was in college, but this had been
Mm.
harder. I always visualize him as like just watching Netflix, like for a year. Just all you literally
Yeah.
sat there, and he plotted out what would happen with carbon dioxide. he saw Tyndall's research. If you lowered it, let's say if you halved it, what would happen? And if you doubled it, what would happen? If you halved it, you
Mm-hmm.
would bring back the ice ages. If you
Yep.
doubled it, temperatures would go up about 4 to 9 degrees. And you would, for him, that was good news because he's in Sweden. Sweden is not a great place in the winter. So when he was looking at it, he was like, um, people in science in that era, they were always, the science for them was always like a sort of good news bad news joke. So that Tyndall had said there's an iron law of science, which is what is good for you in one respect is bad for you in another. And Arrhenius, who's kind of an optimist and a guy who kind of loved high living. So one of the fun things for me is the person who found this would kind of be looking at the people who were like, we have to live less happily. We shouldn't drink. We shouldn't enjoy our food. He's like, well, I don't know. I found this and like life is also a pleasant thing. But what he said is, hey, maybe there's a good thing, which is everybody is just burning through coal like crazy. Like what he was one of the first scientists to plot out how soon it would be that oil would disappear. And if not for things like fracking, he would have been quite right. We have become way better at finding oil, but he had figured out pretty much accurately when America and Britain's oil reserves would go. But he said one of the positives is that we are burning so much of this stuff that at least we will have more equitable climes for heavily propagating mankind. And some of his friends were so pleased by the idea of a warmer Sweden that they would talk about it like, Svante, let's know what we should do. We should take some old coal mines where they've mostly gotten all the coal out, and we should light them on fire and have them just keep sending out more smoke, and we can warm up Sweden way ahead of schedule. So yeah, so
Oh man.
we've had the science for an extremely long time, and that was a hugely surprising thing for me to learn. I think another giant weird moment for me was by the early part of last century, by
Mm-hmm.
probably about 95, 100 years ago, cover of the New York Times. And right between, just to give you a sense, this is 1933. It's between a story about Al Capone. It's about closing down speakeasies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right between, this is the above the fold in the New York Times. Al Capone, we got to close these speakeasies. And on the other side is the Nazis who promised to end their attacks on Jews in the Reich. That was they guessed wrong on
Of
that one.
course.
And then
Yeah.
right in the middle is a story about climate change, which is longest warm spell in American history. There's a red line that's been going up for 25 years. Longest warm spell since 1776. Experts are baffled. So
Yeah.
it really took until about 1956 for scientists to say, Arrhenius was correct about this. And this was another moment that really committed me to spending the 7 years that I ended up spending. The first great American climate scientist is a man named Roger Revelle. And wonderfully, this brings us back to what we were talking about before. Life is fascinating. This is the best story about education that I know. Roger Revelle, one of his prize students was Al Gore at Harvard.
Oh,
And
really?
he took it really seriously. He was like, Revelle said, this is going to happen. Here are the charts proving that it is happening. And Gore said, I spent a very long time thinking about the charts and graphs that Professor Revelle showed us at Harvard. And one of the things that he did, he blew up a large version of it, and he would bring it to his weekly Friday lunch with President Clinton so that he made sure that President Clinton was educated about this. But so Roger Revelle, he did the research and he found one mistake that Revelle had made, and it was a terrifying mistake. But anyway, he didn't talk about it in Tellus, or he didn't talk about it in IO or the JAMA in the Journal of Applied Meteorology. It's in Time magazine in May of 1956, and not a subtle story. It's one big greenhouse. And there's Roger Revelle saying, if this carbon dioxide release continues, in about 50 years, it could have a violent effect on world climate. I can see from your face that you would have written the book too.
Yeah, that's to be honest with you, that That is so what this show is about, is the humanization of people. And I think that when people hear about Al Gore and what he thought about greenhouse gases, you have two sides of that, right? You have the people that are, oh, he was a climate alarmist, or you have people that are, oh, he was just trying to make money off of it, right? And very rarely do people humanize the person and recognize that this guy was being taught by Ravel and was a student of his and took this very seriously and wanted to take that to Clinton, not because he wanted to make a ton of money off of it, or not because he wanted to cause some kind of crazy crisis because he wanted to take power or something of that sort, but because he cared about it. And that's a big part of why I started this show, was because I wanted to show people that not every politician is corrupt. Not every politician is accepting money from big oil companies and being lobbied to create laws that are bad for us and enriching them. So that's actually a really interesting story about that. And yes, very concerning. The language that he used about the violent change, I think one of the things that we have a real hard time with getting to the denier portion of your book is that language oftentimes can be accepted as being something as a bit of a warning. If somebody uses something like the word violent, it's trying to help you to accept that something could be bad. But also it can be used as a bit of a misnomer that, oh, that they were doing that to attempt to control you. And what you hear a lot in climate denial right now is they go, well, 50 years ago, he said there was going to be a violent change and it never happened. And what I tend to say to that is oftentimes that I think that, obviously, first of all, 50 years ago, our instruments and stuff were different than what we have today. And our projections are not always perfect, even though, as you said, 200 years ago, somebody was doing these tests, or almost 200 years ago, people were doing these tests that were absolutely insane that they're even capable of doing. The human race as a whole, whether either comes to, finding heavenly bodies without any type of instrument and predicting them being there through mathematics, or finding, chemicals in our atmosphere and testing for them by having a perfume guy come by and dropping off some Calvin Klein. It's really amazing and oftentimes take it for granted. And I think what we saw, we were talking a little bit about this, like you said, in the green room, about Patrick Moore. And you already brought up something, and that is at a certain portion of carbon, we enter an ice age. I think that's less than 250, right? 250 parts per million. And over 350, I want to say, is when we start to enter the danger zone. So it's a very delicate balance. There's not a lot of wiggle room.
350 is sort of where 350 is kind of around where we started. I can check it, but we're up around 420 now. So we're going to try to fight our way back down. Exactly. But 450
and so
yeah.
With the denial, with people that are denying this types of stuff, what they continue to point out is, Patrick Moore's research, which Patrick Moore was not in any way, he wasn't a scientist. He didn't have a background in this. He has no expertise. He has no training, no education. He claims he allegedly co-founded Greenpeace, and then went on to start a corporation named Green Spirit, which allegedly would shill for companies like Monsanto. He famously said in one of his books or an interview that people could drink Roundup because glyphosate wasn't bad for you, which he got called out for in I think it was a French interview where the guy said, "Oh, I have some glyphosate. I actually have some Roundup. Will you drink it?" Yeah. And he said, "No." Yeah. And he said, "Well, why not? I thought you said it's fine to drink it. You tell people they can drink it." And he said, "Well, no, I'm not an idiot. I'm not going to do
John,
that."
Whoever did that, they're a fan of that movie, Aaron Brockovich. That's the trick that Julia Roberts plays on the guys from Pacific Gas and Electric. Says, you're saying hexavalent chromium is okay to drink. Well, it's in your water right now, and they just stop drinking immediately. So you just learned that person's a cinephile.
Wow, probably. You are actually probably right. I didn't know that. And of course, he also was one of the people that called into kind of account the hockey stick by Michael Mann, right? Yeah. Michael Mann created the hockey stick chart that shows that since the Industrial Revolution, carbon has gone up by this much, and this it correlates with the degrees going up on the Earth. And when you have people like him, and you ask yourself, he's obviously got a lot of money. He's got a lot of people that are willing to listen to him. Some of them willing to drink Roundup. A lot like Donald Trump, actually. Do you think? Because one of the things Patrick Moore was really good at was that he could take information that was complex and simplify it. And that's something that we see in today's day and age with TikToks or with really explosive headlines. Donald Trump with some of the certain keywords or buzzwords that he likes to use. They package it in a way that is a little bit easier and more palatable for climate deniers to accept and to pass it around using memes, headlines, and short clips. Do you think your book, which uses humor and entertainment and is like much easier to read than say like a big textbook on statistics? I have one right here by Steven Pinker called The Enlightenment Now. And this is, for me, this is a great book. It's got a lot of great statistics about how much better society is today, but not a lot of people want to read that. It's not very entertaining. Do you think
we should both apologize, Professor Pinker, because I know Professor Pinker. He's a great communicator, so he made something would have been possible. He's the only person who could have made that readable. But do I think,
do you think that the best way to get people on board with climate change nowadays and understand it is to create what you created, and that's a entertaining, funny book? Do you think that's the best way to go?
Yeah, well, John, I obviously thought that, and so it's a great question. I thought that because I knew that I'm like you, I didn't want to read books about it, and I ended up having to read lots and lots of books about it. But yeah, I do. But I think so. Yes, I also it happened to be just such a wild story to say to people, hey, to give people a 70-year head start on something, 1956, and to have them not act on it. Jesus, what a story! It's just like it's like Dr. Strangelove in the slowest possible motion, or it's like Catch-22, but it's the whole planet. But on the denier thing, I've thought about that a lot, and it's been fun talking to, or both disturbing and fun talking to scientists about it. The deniers, so the denial movement, and I'd be curious what your experience is. The deniers themselves, they were organized, and one of the shocking things is there was a very small number. One of the leaders of that movement, he said there's really only about 24 of us. And so if you've ever wondered what one person can accomplish, in a very negative sense, these 24 people showed just what you can do. Like they frustrated the will of our country and the will of people all over the world, and they frustrated it for about 30 years. But an interesting thing about them is that by 2009, they understood that they were beaten. And we can talk about, in the remaining time, we can talk about why they thought that. But when they were being upfront with both the New York Times and the Guardian, so the leading British paper, leading American paper, and what one of them told the Guardian is, what one of them told the Guardian is, it's almost a lost cause. They came back. They were like Jason or like the Ghostface killers in Scream. They came back for one final assault that lasted about 2 or 3 years. But they basically haven't been a factor for about 6 or 7 years. Like they're there, but it seems like, tell me what your experience is. They don't seem to be convincing people anymore. Like you'll notice that in the presidential campaign during the primaries, the short Republican primaries, that's where you would hear just like the good old fashioned right-wing Republican denial. But you haven't heard that. Like you don't really hear it on television anymore. You don't see it in newspapers anymore. And you don't see it that much in Congress. And that puts us in a fascinating situation, which is we don't have an excuse anymore for why nothing is being done about climate. What we have to all look at when we look at each other is that we have decided that we're not going to do anything about this. We're just going to roll the dice. And that is a fascinating thing. Again, I'm curious what your experience is, but my experience is people put on their voice changes slightly. They get a very solemn look befitting the issue. It's a little bit like you told them that a relative that they forgot they had, that relative died. That's the look that they have when you bring up climate change. Like, oh, I know I'm supposed to look concerned about this. But we have clearly decided as a people that we are going to let this go. And that has been a fascinating thing to notice.
Yeah. So as far as I go, I have on my channel, I have a mix of people because I'm I'm willing to take pushback from almost anybody on my ideas. So I get a little bit of the conspiracy minded. And what I noticed in working at my store was during COVID, what we had was on the left, we had people that were generally really skeptical of big pharma, very skeptical of the government, people that didn't want the vaccine to be mandated. So those people generally were very climate friendly people. They believed in climate change. They believed in a lot of what you would call like the foundation of hippie beliefs during the 70s of freedoms and, love who you want and such. But what I experienced during the 2019 through recently 2022-23 was that a lot of those people joined up with very conservative conspiracy groups like QAnon. So even personally, I have a friend who his wife joined QAnon and went from being a person that was very supportive of LGBT people, and she ended up becoming a believer in the fact that she believes now that the government is actually attempting to depopulate the world through homosexuality. And what I have to say to that, and I like hearing from you that you have a positive outlook on this, because my outlook has actually been pretty negative, because recently, in speaking to people on the climate denial side, I've actually gotten a lot more of that stuff coming back. And one of the things I recently heard was that green energy and Joe Biden, this is the conspiracy theory, is being lobbied by people in green energy to make profits off of things like solar panels, like windmills, like energy through water. And in some way, they're trying to depopulate the earth of poor people, because they know they won't be able to purchase new electric cars, or they can't afford solar panels, and they're going to be disenfranchised by the wealthy. More of this dystopian stuff. Now, I generally wouldn't be super concerned about this, because a long time ago, it used to be your one friend's older brother that was smoking a joint, and he'd tell you about how the moon landing wasn't real and how the earth was flat. And you'd say, well, how do you know that? And he would say, well, I read a book, oh, okay. And then he'd leave, and you go, oh, that's just him, no big deal. But in the YouTube community, what I have noticed as far as content creators and influencers is that you now have something that is different than mainstream media. You no longer have just Fox News and CNN and even the Newsmaxes and the RSBNs. Now you have independent influencers.
Yeah.
On the left, you have people like David Pakman. You have people like Brian Tyler Cohen. You have people like myself. On the right, you have people like Ben Shapiro. You have people like Dave Rubin, Steven Crowder, and specifically Jordan Peterson. So Jordan Peterson, who is a psychologist who grew famous off of his opinions on pronouns, yes, has recently decided that he is going to push this conspiracy theory that there is big money behind green energy, climate change isn't real. The statistics that we currently have are actually from faulty data, like the hockey stick. He uses the hockey stick, actually, which the hockey stick just recently, that guy won a lawsuit against the two people that defamed him for $1 million. But Jordan Peterson has now taken up that mantle. And what that has done is it has encouraged people on lower levels, influencers on lower levels, because they see the financial benefit. because like I said, now instead of just having your Fox News and your CNNs, now you have this conspiracy minded area that both includes people that used to be on the left and people that always existed on the right that were very conservative about climate change and whether or not they believed it due to their bias against people like Al Gore, that now are seeing that is financially beneficial to bring these people into the fold, get them to subscribe to their channel, get them to donate to their because they're fighting the good fight against the evil green energy. I mean, don't they just put big in front of everything? So big green energy.
God, big
Yeah.
green. Shocking, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Is that not insane?
It's really surprised, especially surprised because one of the problems that denial had for the last, during the period that denial itself saw as kind of its death throes is they couldn't attract young talent. And so one of the things they were aware of was that there kept being a lot of graybeards, basically. I'm shocked. Like one thought I had while you were talking about the people who it's like, who are you hanging out with? Like, who are these people who are prey to this shit?
Everybody emails me. Everybody emails me. Yeah.
But I was surprised to hear about Peterson. Like I was very surprised by his thing about pronouns, but generally I haven't seen, like, you don't see Ben Shapiro denying climate change. I don't think Dave Rubin denies climate change. The science has been verified, but basically there was a international report that would come out every 5 or 6 years. It was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was through the UN. And they would publish their results every 5 to 6 years. And in February of 2007, they released a report that basically removed all doubt. And so you might get some wildcat people, just like, hey, we found that there's a vein of people who will still believe this shit, and we're gonna mine them for whatever we get out of it. But generally, there haven't been a lot of authoritative voices who've tried to come forward and say this isn't happening. But for people who don't believe it, to some degree, I can understand why, because one of the things that was shocking to me was that moment in 2007. So let me give you a little more background about the kind of thing that can lead in a weird way to conspiracy thinking. So 1956, Roger Revelle verifies basically what Arrhenius was talking about. Some stuff that he set in motion was verified by a number of scientists between 56 and 79. I want to answer your question first before I go back to this, because the example that I was going to use would explain part of that kind of the room for conspiracy thinking. But the basic thing is this. I'll go back to that in a second. Think of that as a teaser, people who are listening to both of us. But 2007, it is giant news. It has been a huge worldwide debate. Is it really true? Someday the definitive answer is going to come in. And the definitive answer rolls in February 2007. It's a press conference from Paris. It is the front page everywhere on the planet. A guy named Richard Alley, he's one of the scientists who chaired the working group. He says in the press conference, "We did good science. We are proud of this science. We're confident about it. This is real. This is real. This is real. Now act. The ball's back in your court. Our job was to verify this. It's going to happen. This is what you have to do. Now act." And so poll numbers were great. Every presidential candidate was in favor of acting on this issue. The three majors were John McCain, Hillary Clinton, and of course, Senator Barack Obama. And so the moment was right. All the polls, I think 70% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats, 80% of independents, they all said, let's act. And the thing that we chose to do that year was to outlaw incandescent light bulbs.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
When we do that, given that kind of headwind, right? If you've been hearing it, you've been listening, it's in the corner of your ear while you're pushing your grocery cart or your laundry cart, right? And you're thinking, okay, they're going to work it out. And they've been telling us how serious this is. And then when the action that they take is so small, you begin to wonder. Similarly, the reports from the IPCC have gotten more and more dire. And those are scientists who are sciencing their hearts out. They are working round the clock. One of the first scientists who worked on the IPCC. He's a great climate pioneer from your state. He's from Stanford, a guy named Stephen Schneider, and he had a chair in physics at Stanford, and then he was working on the IPCC. And he referred to his work at Stanford as his pro bono job, because what had become his real work was working on the IPCC. That's how time consuming that work was. Everybody took it very seriously. And in 2018, they released a report that made people's eyebrows go up, which is we had 12 years in the world to reduce our output by 45%. And if we didn't do that, we were guaranteeing that we were going to have climate change above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that is very bad for us as a planet, very bad for us among the other things that are on the planet. And everyone took it very solemnly. Everybody had that voice that there's been a death in the family and we have to do something about it. And we are 6 years into it. We had 12 years and we haven't cut 22% of our carbon output. In China, last year, China built 168 new coal plants. Coal is the worst carbon dioxide polluter. That means they were building one about every 2 days.
Wow.
More or less every 2 days. So when people hear that and they see serious people on the news, or they read serious people quoting it on Twitter, right? Or they see people sending it around on Facebook for people who use Facebook, and then they see that no one does everything, I think that's a vacuum that often gets filled with people saying, clearly they don't believe it or they would be doing something.
Yeah. And, speaking of those scientists that you're talking about, one of the things that I also hear from people that believe the conspiracy side of it, you said that there's sometimes that you can understand. I do too. That's why I listen to people. I'm willing to get pushback from people because I don't believe that I'm 100% correct on anything. And one of the things they point out is how those scientists back then were bought by big tobacco and were capable of being used in a way that tobacco could say, look, no, tobacco is not bad for you. Tobacco is actually good for you. Here's a scientist or a biologist, as you had pointed out in the book, that was willing to say these things. And I look at that and I say, I hear what you're saying. But when I recently saw a article that said, I think it's something like 99% of all studies now agree that man-made carbon does affect the climate. And so my point of view generally on that is, yes, there may be 4 studies that have been either manipulated or looked at by certain people that says, sure, there may be something to look at, but there's, 10,000. There are multiple meta-analysis, which is what I tend to go to, is somebody else looking at tons of other studies and then picking them apart for who influenced them, what confounding factors were part of them. And then I look at those things and I always say, it's like our court system. It's where the preponderance of evidence rests. So if the preponderance of evidence currently rests on the side that man-made carbon or man-made emissions are an issue, then that's where I rest until the preponderance shifts to the other side. And I think what you have right now is you have a lot of people, and this is Fahrenheit 451. I'm a big fan of Fahrenheit 451. There's a portion in Fahrenheit 451 where it says that things will be taken from documentaries and it'll be cut down to 20-minute segments and it'll be cut down to 2-minute seconds and eventually it'll be 15-second summaries and bombastic headlines. And I think that that's where we live now. And I think that easy to consume ability or easy to consume information has emboldened people that maybe at one point or another would not have spoke up, would not have had an opinion on these things, but because they're scrolling through things like TikTok, scrolling through things like Instagrams, and the algorithm is continuing to feed them this information, I'm actually pretty concerned that, unfortunately, that those people are starting to become more prevalent in our society. And that's a bigger question, right? That's a question that has more to do with sociology. We'd have to bring Jonathan Haidt in here. But I think that I'm always an optimist, right? I think of this problem that we're going through as an optimist versus pessimist problem. with everybody else in the back seat like kids. It's like you're on a trip and the kids don't know where they're going yet. They're sitting in the back, they're ambiguous to the situation, they have no idea. And the two people in the front seat, the mom and the dad, one is an optimist, the other is a pessimist, and they're constantly fighting over who gets to be at the wheel. And the optimist wants to take you to the fair, the greatest fair on earth, and the pessimist wants to drive you off the cliff. But like I said, in the back is children that are fighting, always fighting. And they are unaware of whether or not they are going off a cliff or they're going to the fair. And my job, I believe, is to always push forth optimism, because I do believe there's a balance between the two. That's why I listen to the conspiracy theorists, is I do think that they put some type of boundaries upon our government, boundaries upon our scientists that are necessary. But I believe, because I'm the optimist, that we're sitting on the precipice of a potential gain in our favor, and that is AI and supercomputers. Yeah. Because one of the biggest things that conspiracy theorists like to point out is that the data, this is actually from Jordan Peterson. If you ever want to look up a video that kind of distills what I'm talking about with Jordan Peterson, he has a debate with another YouTuber named Destiny. It's supposed to be a conversation. It turns into a debate. And he debates him at one point.
John, we're always debating with Destiny. Every one of us in our own way are having a debate with Destiny at every moment.
Him and Jordan Peterson have a talk about a lot of things. And at one point they talk about climate change. And that's when Jordan Peterson brings up, Jordan tends to nowadays on occasion become very triggered and have a very pessimistic point of view, which is crazy because I started watching Jordan Peterson back when he did the 12 Steps book. And I actually really thought very positively of his 12 Steps book, regardless of his other opinions. That's how I look at people, is, there is good and bad to everybody. And I feel like he's really gone down. Like he's driving the car right off the cliff. So my point of view, because he brings up the data multiple times. He brings up our ability to test the temperature of water, the inconsistencies of using cloud cover or not using cloud cover in data, and the inconsistency of us measuring the data. Because when you look back at the charts of the last 100 years, there's actually like missing years. And I think that the advent of supercomputers and specifically AI is going to change that conversation. Because I think once you have something with a computing power of 800,000 cores, you start to be able to look at something as complex as our ecology and the atmosphere, and you start to get better information, right? So do you think, now neither one of us are scientists in this field, but I want your personal opinion on this. Do you think that something like that will lead to a more optimistic outlook if we can provide better information to people?
I don't know, but one thing I kept thinking while you were saying that is a friend of mine who is a very committed progressive person. He went to work for some of the senators who care the most about this issue publicly. And there are people who would talk about how we shouldn't use plastic water bottles, or should limit where we're driving, or think about where we're vacationing. He was very disappointed to discover that in private, these senators all believe that there will be a gadget that solves this. And so that it turned out that what these senators, and it sort of explains a little bit why there's been so much conversation about this without any real action taken. And AI is a really positive development. AI is extraordinary. One of the stories that I love the most this spring is that they think AI will be able to allow us to speak with whales. Whales have an extremely complicated system of clicks and whistles that obviously a human would have some difficulty deciphering. But they think that they can train AIs to actually come up with a way that we could speak with these giant mammal cousins of ours who are moving in this very stately way under our boats. But the story, which was in the Atlantic and is really cool, is there's a moral thing, because what if we talk to them and the first thing they say is stop running those giant ships overhead? Like
Mm-hmm.
I think the majority of our stuff is still shipped by boat, and we would be in a quandary. One of the things that allows us to act the way we act is that birds and raccoons and whales can't say, hey, fuck, cut this out. This is terrible
Yeah.
for us. But yeah, I think that it's interesting to think about what AI could do with this issue. AI might be able to find a solution to this. And the solutions so far there's two things. The solutions have had to do with people moderating their consumption. And we seem
Mm-hmm.
to not want to moderate our consumption. The second solution, and this is again the kind of thing that people understand, and it can lead conspiracy thinking to fill the vacuum. If we were serious about the issue, the scientists know what the solution is. There is a solution to this which has been available to us since 1956. Time magazine, because climate change was a very popular topic in the late 50s. And so it was such a popular topic that if you were writing about other things in places like Time magazine, you would mention climate. And so when Time was doing a big story on nuclear power, it added, one of the great things is nuclear power doesn't lead to more greenhouse warming. So you can cheat the greenhouse by having these nuclear plants. The greatest American climate scientist on this issue after Professor Revelle was Jim Hansen. And he just said, look, we know, he writes editorial after editorial about this. There is a solution available to us. We need to go nuclear. If we were serious, we would go nuclear. And the fact that we haven't gone nuclear would suggest to people that they're saying it's real, but they're not acting as if it's real. And so that gives us two choices. We could act on it, or a certain number of people are going to stroke their chins and say, maybe it's not real after all. They said they only have 12 years, but they haven't changed their behavior in a single way.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And I myself, I try to tell people all the time, I don't claim, I grew up in a gang-ridden area, and as a child, I didn't join any of those gangs, and I don't intend to join any of the gangs that.
Well,
people
don't commit yourself,
right?
John, because there's still time left,
There's
and there
still
will
time.
be recruiting drives in the future. So don't.
Someone will reference this video at one point or another, I'm sure, and be like, he said. But I have been a person that has pointed out that nuclear power or nuclear energy is exactly what you just said, is a solution that we act like does not exist. And at times that leads me down those pathways of whether or not people are realistic about these things or not. But, I think that what we have, and I think I heard you say this in an interview before, is we have a lot of people that have a lot of amenities that run off of fossil fuels and stuff that, whether or not they want to believe it or not, they don't want to give them up.
That's right.
And I was talking to you a little bit about the 3-body problem, which is actually a book that was written in, I think, China, and then it became a TV series. And in watching that, I'll try not to spoil it for anybody watching, but in a certain way, they form a question where something is going to happen in 400 years. In that 400 years, society is going to cease to exist if nothing is done about it. Now, there's many different options or paths for those people. There are the people that are saying, hey, we have to prepare our children to prepare their grandchildren, and so on, to be ready for this thing that is going to happen 400 years from now. And that's what I think your climate change activists are thinking, right? And then you have people that go out in the street and party. And people that, they're going, I'm going to do all the drugs, I'm going to drink all the alcohol, I'm going to break all the laws, because you know what, who cares? And then there's people that are ambiguous, like I said about the kids in the back, right? Like, hey, I'm just going to get up and go to work tomorrow, because why do I care about something that happens 400 years from now? And it really asks the question, or begs the question, what type of moral responsibility do we have to our future? Now, I have 2 children. I love my children currently. It changes on a day-to-day basis. But I think about their future. That's why I do this show. This is why I try to make an impact on society, is to hopefully provide my children with a good future, something that when I was growing up, I didn't have a great childhood. I want to make sure that theirs is the best and that their adulthood is also great. So I land in the area of we have moral responsibility. So that's why I think of things like nuclear energy. That's why I do things. I'm a big lead by example person. I say, mind your bubble and try to show others. I think it was George Carlin that said, I don't get up here to change your mind. I get up here to show you that I used my mind. And that's the same way I try to live my life. Is I don't walk around telling people to change the things they do. I show them what I do and hope that they see that what I do is successful and that helps them to live a better life. So that's my opinion on that quandary, is that yes, if something's going to happen 400 years from now, I believe we have a moral responsibility to prepare future generations and help them have a better life. What do you think about that question? I find it to be a really awesome question.
I have so many thoughts on that question, but the main thing is we're not. I mean, the 400 years thing, that would be kind of a luxury because what the IPCC was talking about is like 2050 and 2060.
Wow.
And just to go back to something that you were saying earlier, I think if you showed Dr. Ravel what has happened to climate in the 70 years since he spoke to Time magazine, he would say that there's been a violent effect on the Earth's climate. Like the amount of, I think it's 1.5 degrees Celsius that we've already added. But that is a huge change. And to have seen the kind of summer that we had last year is the kind of thing that the climate scientists have been warning about for 30 or 40 years. And it was so bad that a lot of them thought that would be the proof that people needed. And Gallup ran a poll towards the end of the summer. And what's your guess as to how many people believed climate change by the end of last summer?
Last summer, are we talking by political party or total?
No, just people, just person by person.
Okay. I know that Democrats there's more registered Democrats than Republicans. I'm going to go.
That's not a bad way to do it because it is more than it is above majority.
Yeah, I just read a poll that said 76% of Democrats and 52% of Republicans.
Yeah, and then,
I'm going to go.
No, you nailed it. If you did that work, you're looking at like 63. But 70% of Americans could see climate change in their own communities in the last 5 years. So there is no question about that. And so we've already had that violent effect. What was fascinating to me is that Ravel had said saltwater, we're going to see if saltwater will run in the streets of New York City and London. And so if he said 50 years, that would have been 2006. And 2012 was the second rainiest year in Britain's history. And the only reason that water didn't run in the streets of London is that they put a giant sea gate called the Thames Gate, which stopped the 2 or 3 times when it would have absolutely swollen into London. And it did. Hurricane Sandy is 50 years plus 6 from Professor Ravel's prediction. And saltwater did run through the streets of Lower Manhattan. There was an engineer who was down there, and he said that there were waves on Wall Street, and the saltwater just ran in and it corroded the subway tunnels, and it knocked out electricity for the lower half of the island. So if he had seen that, he would have said, hey, I did pretty good. I was 6 years off. But there's so it's not just our grandkids, it is our kids. And if you're young enough and if you are eating well enough, or if you are doing your routine fasting enough, it'll be some of us as well. But there was a great moment. A lot of companies found it to their advantage to get on this bandwagon. And that is the kind of thing that also leads to conspiracies when you see Walmart getting behind climate. Now, in one way, it's wonderful, but it's always weird. Like if you do a lot of news reading, the way both of us and a lot of your followers do, people are almost suicidally honest. If a reporter shows up, it's like, don't you know people are going to read this? And so in 2007, when Walmart started doing a push on environmental issues, the reporter from the Times said, people are saying that your wages are low, people are saying that you don't give your workers enough health care. And they're also saying that for a company that talks about America, all your supply chains are China. Uh, so, why are you investing in green when you could be dealing with these issues? And the head of Walmart said, well, we found there was not as much flexibility on those issues. You couldn't do as much with those as you could with going green. And it's much cheaper and easier. So at that time, Walmart, in fact, they created a new position. They created a vice president of sustainability, and they picked someone who was already in their corporate structure, and they made this guy their VP for sustainability. And then they would talk about very proudly about how his business card was only 2/3 normal size and 100% recycled paper. So even starting this position was not affecting the climate in a bad way. And then he would go around to public forums making Walmart seem better. And there was a great moment. He was at the Clinton Global Initiative in, I think this would have been 2009 or 2010. And he was there with the head of Timberland. And then he was there with a scientist from the Nature Conservancy who has been working on this issue for 20 or 30 years. And the Walmart guy was saying things that seemed exciting to Walmart. For example, do you remember Hamburger Helper from when you were a kid? Do you ever have Hamburger Helper?
Oh, yes.
Just a way of stretching out your hamburger. It helps you to, if you want to stretch it to 2 or 3 meals, that's what Hamburger Helper is. And so Walmart, this is the kind of thing that Walmart was doing to save the planet. They looked at the box of Hamburger Helper and they realized that the noodles were really curly. And they said, look, if you flatten the noodles, you can have thinner boxes. And so we'll have to drive fewer trucks and there will be an 11% reduction in Hamburger Helper related emissions. And so the guy, so the head of Timberland is up there at the Clinton Global Initiative on stage. There were reporters and there are serious, well-meaning people there. And he says, that is such a profound story. You straighten out the frickin' noodle and the world gets better. And so then the Walmart guy is feeling great. And he says, look, we have to do this for our grandchildren. And at that point, the Nature Conservancy guy speaks up and he says, I hear about this all the time, people talking about their grandchildren. And what I've surmised from the way we deal with this is I don't think we care about our grandchildren that much. Like, we don't know who they are yet. We know our children, but not our grandchildren. But if we did care about our grandchildren, we would be behaving in a different way. So what I, as a scientist, have learned is that nobody seems to care about their grandchildren. And it was fascinating. The guy from Walmart just started to cry. I've never seen a moment like that. It used to be on YouTube, and I think Walmart gobbled it back. Whenever people are talking about their grandchildren, I think of that wicked smile that crossed the Nature Conservancy guy's face. It's one of those things where you just know, like you see it about 10 or 15 seconds, you just know somebody is going to say something that is an absolute truth. And it was just, F it, I'm going to say it. And what we've learned from the way we deal with stuff is that I don't think people care about their grandchildren that much.
Wow. And that's so well done, because to be honest with you, that is the truth of the situation. When it comes to who we are as people, we're so built to care about what is now. And it seems like something new, because when we talk about, I tell people all the time, my ideals on evolution or specifically on morality, my ideals on morality are built on 2 books. That is William von Hippel's Social Leap book and Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis. Happiness Hypothesis really explains. You've read that book?
My brother loves the Haidt book.
Yeah.
Can you say the other book again? The first one?
It's called The Social Leap by William von Hippel. And it's an alternative theory to why our brains doubled in size. Instead of the idea that it grew because of opposable thumbs and tools, it is instead over social situations involving hunter-gatherer groups. And, I don't know that it's a fringe theory or not, but, it is an alternative theory. And to me, like, those 2 books really kind of changed my whole mentality. Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis explained emotions to me in a way that made me better understand being human, and how the chemicals in our bodies interact, and how things like hate and disgust are triggered by certain situations. And then William von Hippel's ideas on the fact that your brain may have doubled in size to deal with social situations, and how those social situations really do are 100% some of the motivators and why we do certain things.
So wait, so
Those two,
Gossip Girl is why we evolved? That
yeah.
is huge news.
And that's actually one of the things he goes into. Not Gossip Girl specifically. Sorry, William von Hippel. I've already naysayed Steven Pinker's ability to write an entertaining book, and now I'm on here saying William von Hippel read about Gossip Girls. He talked about shame and embarrassment, and how those emotions interacted with the hunter gatherers, and why you didn't just steal all the elk meat for yourself, why you didn't just murder Bill in his sleep because you disliked him, things like that. And it was very interesting. It's a real short book, but it was very interesting. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think that we have so much that is still a part of us from evolution, of looking forward towards survival and our reward systems and our gratification systems. The idea that things like salt and sugar being in the same product now is so enticing to us. The salted caramel ice cream, right? It's because it doesn't exist in nature, and when we get a hold of it, our body tells us, eat as much of that as you can, because you may
That's
never
what my
see
body
it
is telling me right now as you're talking
Yeah.
about it. Absolutely. So I'm sure you saw my face light up.
And so I think that unfortunately we still have this idea that we live in the moment. And that's why we don't think about our grandkids. It's why we can think about our children when we see our children, but whether or not it hurts some people's feelings or not, they're not always on the forefront of your mind. It's the now. I call us a fast food society, and that what we want is gratification now. We want our Netflix to not lag. It must not buffer. We want anything. We want our Uber Eats to be 10 minutes faster. And as long as these conveniences continue to exist, we don't want to do the hard things, because that's far out in the future. And I think that a big part of a change in our society is going to have to be a bit of altruism towards the future. And that's why I thought that question about 400 years and what you would do was such an awesome question to come from. I'm a guy that sits there and thinks about the TV series after I watch it, and my wife's like, it's over. Like, the Marvel superhero didn't do anything for moral good. It was just a movie. And I'm like, well, hold on. I think there was a moral, so I sit here and I think about that quandary, and I think it's really, really important, because I don't know that I'm even correct.
Wait, your wife saw Tony give his life to stop Thanos. He knew when he snapped. Yeah, I think she must have tuned out during that moment. She's wrong. Like,
no, she's just
a nation of film goers saw him change things for the better. But anyway,
all my wife was worried about was that Robert Downey Jr. died. Okay, she was like, "What?" I was like, "Hey, okay."
And Robert Downey Jr. gave up a great role to make that movie better. So 2 acts of altruism in universe and outside universe.
Oh, so altruistic. So we'll ask you the one question. So with my politicians, the one I usually ask them at the end is, how do we get money out of politics? That's the one that drives them the most nuts. But for a person that comes in here on my political show and is not a politician, or somebody that's currently participating in that, we'll ask you the second hardest question, and that is, what political candidate that's running for president right now is the person that will most likely create positive change in the climate area, as far as who's running right now?
My answer won't be the least bit surprising on that, but let me work my way toward it, because you were bringing up some things that I thought were fascinating, and I did want to bring up that last point, which would make people doubt about the political process. But what you were saying was fascinating, and it shows just how circular this kind of issue has been, and it's wild and cool. But in the early 90s, by about 95, a professor in the business school at MIT, he looked at the situation and he said, if you wanted to design a problem that human institutions can't deal with, you couldn't find a better one than global warming.
Yeah.
And the reason why is it goes against everything that we're designed to want. Like, we want to make things better for ourselves and for our kids. It's really hard to see our grandparents. And then also human institutions, no politician is going to be elected because he promises to give people less. And so if you're in a society where you have elections not just every 4 years, but every 2 years, it's hard to think of candidates straightening their ties, getting the foundation put on, making sure that hair looks okay, and saying, vote for me, I'm going to make your life more challenging. And so then 20 years later, when it had become so difficult to get people to act on this issue, this I do not think is the case. I think it's hard to get the people who can actually make things better for us. It's hard to get them to act, but we've focused on the from us up as opposed to top down. But it became so difficult to convince us and the people that you were talking about, like your wife who joined QAnon. I didn't know there
not
was
my
a
wife,
formal,
but yeah, somebody
your
else's
friend's wife.
Yeah.
No, sorry, forgive me. I didn't for a second think it was your wife, but I think I was thrown by it because I didn't know you could join. I just thought you just started acting crazy, and that's how people knew you were in QAnon. I didn't know there was
There's
a
a
formal
whole
joining
thing to it.
Seriously?
I have a
Shocked.
podcast that I can't release on it. I did a podcast with him.
Please
and,
just send me a link. I want to check that out. But
yeah, I'll send you a link to it. Yeah, yeah. There's a chat option. If you give me an email to contact you, I'll send you the private
I would
link
love
to
to
it.
see it. That's great.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
But yeah, like, it was so difficult to get people to understand about this issue. Like your friend whose wife is now permitted to show her QAnon card when she goes around.
Got a big Q on her car, I'm sure.
Yeah, yes. But they have a Yale School for Climate Communication, and what the head of that school had learned in the 20 years since the guy from MIT had spoken on it, which is that there's no issue with a poorer fit, with a more difficult fit for our basic wiring. So that Yale had taken 20 years to say the exact same thing that the guy at MIT had said. And the fact that you have no action but just people verifying the same things is difficult for all of us who are waiting for something to happen. So the second thing as to why politics is something that the climate scientists, and this is what you and I were talking about in our green room, why they've stopped caring about politics. So did you see the Oppenheimer movie?
I have not seen it, unfortunately, yet.
But you know what it's about, right? Which is the Manhattan
Project. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Einstein, so yeah.
Einstein, by the way, when we were talking earlier, they understood one of the great things, Edison's, the golden jubilee of light, the 50-year anniversary of light being a useful, portable method of generating light in people's homes, and also the electrical industry. That was celebrated. There was like a giant anniversary. It was like one of those Night of 1,000 Stars things, or like a roast. It was like the celebrity roast of Thomas Edison, but with nary a negative thing said. Like the president was there. I think Madame Curie was there. Like the heads of all the major corporations were there. And Einstein spoke from a secret radio hookup in Berlin. And he said the great inventors of tech, of whom you are the best proponent, have placed mankind in a perfectly new situation to which it has not at all adapted itself yet.
Yep.
And what a haunting thing. He's the only person who said anything negative on that night in 1929, to which we have not at all adapted ourselves yet. So the kind of thing that makes people be a little bit gimlet-eyed about this is scientists like Einstein. They were recruited, although Einstein wasn't a member of the Manhattan Project, they were recruited to work in the national interest. And they gave us radar, which we now use to keep our planes safe and to keep our country safe, and also the atomic bomb. So it is 10 years after the war, and there are still national problems. And so people had this idea, hey, those guys were great. Let's get the band back together. So the Manhattan Project kind of reformed in the 50s as a group, a secret group called the Jason Committee. And Jason was the best physicist from around the country, and they would meet secretly, and they would nominate new members, and they would join. And they were the people who the Pentagon would go to with science questions. And they were the people to whom the president would go, like, hey, tell us what's going on. And by the mid 70s, they'd been checking. What Ravel found out basically was that that it was going to be a lot faster than what Arrhenius thought. Arrhenius thought that we were working on a centuries-long timeline, and it turned out that he had overestimated how much carbon dioxide the oceans would take up, and so it was going to start happening much faster. So there's 20 years of research verifying what Ravel had discovered. And all these reports started coming in the late 70s. The Jason report came in the spring of 79, and they said it was ominous. And the chairman of that report said, not in some out of the way place. He said in the New York Times, the government, these changes are going to start happening in the 90s. We have to start acting on this now. There was another study that same spring from the Council on Economic Quality, and they said, we have to start. This is going to cause changes in the 90s unless mitigating actions are taken immediately. And the president, especially when that Jason report came in, the White House was anxious, and so they turned to our most august research institution, which is the National Academy of the Sciences. Started by President Lincoln. It's an amazing organization. It is, I think, 2,200 of our best scientists. It is a life's honor. It's like joining the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Like, what a,
wow.
So the president turned to them and he said, I need an answer. Like, do a meta study. Just what you were talking about earlier. Is this real? And the 45th anniversary is going to be this July. They reported back on July 29th, 1979 to the White House. They said the results of this intensive study will be reassuring to scientists, because scientists like to know that their work hasn't been wrong over a century. The results of this study will be reassuring to scientists, but disturbing to policymakers. If the carbon dioxide release continues, this panel finds no reason to believe that climate changes will not result, and no reason to believe those changes will be negligible. In no uncertain terms, and we took no action. There was nothing done between July of 1979, nothing serious done between July of 1979 and now. Of all the presidents who've come and gone since, only President Biden has been able to pass any effective legislation on this issue. Yep. So when a culture was given that kind of a head start and did nothing with it, the scientists began to recognize that there wouldn't be action on this issue, especially when President Obama, who I, of course, voted for twice, when he ran in 2008, he said there are two big issues. Energy, that was his don't make people anxious phrase for climate change, and healthcare. But energy we have to tackle first. And then he came in and he did healthcare instead. And that was heartbreaking for the scientists. And they began to realize that for the political class, that this had become just a GOTV thing. It's a get out the vote thing for a specific kind of voter, but they are not going to do anything. And they began to realize that we were going to have to look for responses somewhere else. So obviously, the Democrats are always better on this issue. And President Biden is the only president of the 10 presidents who've dealt with this to have passed significant legislation. But the thing that was fascinating, both reading what scientists like Professor Hansen would say, Dr. Hansen would say, and also talking to scientists is, they do research and they form conclusions, and their research tells them, their research from July of 1979 on, or going back to October of 1957, that politicians will talk about this, but their actions tell us that they don't intend to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Joe Biden with the Infrastructure Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was actually a green energy plan. Right. I believe even in the American Recovery Act, there's some green energy stuff. The Chips and Science Act, in a kind of offset way, takes away transportation and stuff like that, because you're not shipping semiconductors back and forth from here to Taiwan. That, in my opinion, yes, is he is the most forward of presidents when it has came to green energy. And I've said this to
Yeah.
people before. Joe Biden is not perfect. There are things specifically during the 90s in the Democratic Party that I thought, by reaching across the aisle to Republicans, that they did that I did not agree with. And then going into Obama's era, as you spoke about a bit on his energy, I also speak a little bit about his lack of antitrust litigation. I love Obama. I think he's a great president. I think he's one of the greatest presidents of my time. But he was fallible, and as most human beings are. And I think that Joe Biden has, for whatever reason, decided he wanted to make up for some things, or maybe he just, he sees that maybe he sees his grandchildren, and he wants to see them do better. But I think Joe Biden is the person that's going to make the best decisions when it comes to climate change moving forward. I've really loved this conversation, David. It's been great. And as far as your book goes, why don't you tell everybody where they can find it?
They can find it in the usual places. They can find it at Amazon. They can find it at the independent bookstores. They can IndieBound. They can find it at Barnes & Noble. And I hope they find it in their houses next to them, or they find it on their phone and that they're reading it. But until that time, you can find it at bookstores and you can find it online.